born. Let me say that again. In that scant 2 years, I'm talking about the last 2 years, the scant 2 years of this administration's record, this administration has squandered a large projected surplus of some $5.6 trillion over the next decade and taken us to projected deficits as far as the human eye can see. This administration's domestic policy has put many of our states, including my own, in dire financial condition, underfunding scores of essential programs for the people out there who are watching through those electronic lenses. This administration has fostered policies that have slowed economic growth. This administration has ignored urgent matters such as the crisis in health care for our elderly. This administration has been slow to provide adequate funding for homeland security. We've just been talking about that, the distinguished senator from Illinois, Mr. Durbin, and I. This administration has been reluctant to better protect our long and porous borders to the north and to the south, and to the east and the west, where the great oceans form the borders. In foreign policy, this administration has failed to find Osama bin Laden. In fact, just yesterday we heard from him again, marshaling his forces and urging them to kill, kill, kill. This administration has split traditional alliances, possibly crippling, who knows, for all time, international order-keeping entities like the United Nations and NATO. This administration has called into question the traditional worldwide perception of the United States as being a well-intentioned, peacemaking, peace-loving, peacekeeping nation. This administration has turned the patient art of diplomacy on its head, turned the patient art of diplomacy into threats, labeling and name-calling of the sort that reflects quite poorly on the intelligence and sensitivity of our leaders, and which will have consequences for years to come. Calling heads of states pygmies, labeling whole countries as evil, as though we're not evil, as though there is no country that is not evil. Denigrating powerful European allies as irrelevant. These types of crude insensitivities can do our great nation no good. We may have massive military might, and we have. But remember, we've had massive military might before. How many millions of men marched to the drums of war? Only 60 years ago. 13 million American men under arms, was it? Millions. Well, we may have massive military might today, but we cannot fight a global war on terrorism alone. We need the cooperation and the friendship of our time-honored allies, as well as the newer found friends on whom we can attract. Or whom, not strike the word on, whom we can attract with our wealth. Our awesome military machine will do us little good if we suffer another devastating attack on our homeland which severely damages this economy. Our military manpower is already stretched thin, and they're taking them from our native states every day. Yesterday I talked to the Senate about the vacancies, about the empty seats at the dinner tables in the homes of many West Virginians because of the National Guard and reserves departures every day from the state of West Virginia. Yes, there they come. They're law enforcement officers. They're state troopers. They're road builders. They're doctors. They're teachers. They're Sunday school teachers. There they come. These are the men and women who keep the lights burning when the snows fall and darkness comes. But on whom will we depend when these men and women are gone to foreign lands to fight a war, if a war faces us here at home? A different kind of war. Our awesome military machine will do us little good if we suffer another devastating attack on our homeland, which severely damages our economy. As I say, our military forces are already being stretched thin, and we will need the augmenting support of those nations who can supply troop strength, not just sign letters cheering us on. The war in Afghanistan has cost us $37 billion so far. Yes, we bombed those caves. We ran them into the holes, but they could not hide. We ran them out of the holes, and we ran behind them to get them, but there's evidence that terrorism may already be starting to regain its hold in that region. We have not found bin Laden. And unless we secure the peace in Afghanistan, the dark dens of terrorism may yet again flourish in that remote and devastated land. Pakistan as well is at risk of destabilizing forces. This administration has not finished the first war against terrorism, and yet it is eager to embark on another conflict with perils much greater than those in Afghanistan. Is our attention span that short? Have we not learned that after winning the war, one must also secure the peace? Yet we hear little, precious little, about the aftermath of war in Iraq. In the absence of plans, speculation abroad is rife. Will we seize Iraq's oil fields? Becoming an occupying power which controls the price and supply of that nation's oil for the foreseeable future? There are some who think so. To whom do we propose to hand the reins of power in Iraq after Saddam Hussein? Will our war inflame the Muslim world, resulting in devastating attacks on Israel? Will Israel retaliate with its own very potent nuclear arsenal? What are we about to unleash here? The genie is getting out of the bottle. Can it ever be put back? Will the Jordanian and Saudi Arabian governments be toppled by radicals? Bolstered by Iran, which has much closer ties to terrorism than Iraq? Could a disruption of the world's oil supply lead to a worldwide recession? has our senselessly bellicose language and our callous disregard of the interests and opinions of other nations increased the global race to join the nuclear club and make proliferation an even more lucrative practice for nations which need the income? In only the space of 2 short years, this reckless and arrogant administration has initiated policies which may reap disastrous consequences for years. We have heard it asked, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? The question can be shortened. Are we better off than we were 2 years ago? One can understand the anger and the shock of any president after the savage attacks of September 11. One can appreciate the frustration of having only a shadow to chase and an amorphous, fleeting enemy on which it is nearly impossible to exact retribution. But to turn one's frustration and anger into the kind of extremely destabilizing and dangerous foreign policy debacle that the world is currently witnessing is inexcusable from any administration charged with the awesome power and responsibility of guiding the destiny of the greatest superpower on the planet. Frankly, many of the pronouncements made by this administration are outrageous. There's no other word. And yet this chamber is hauntingly silent. Silent. What would John Langdon of New Hampshire say about that? What would Nicholas Gilman of New Hampshire say about that? What would Rufus King and Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts say? What would Alexander Hamilton, who signed the Constitution from the state of New York, say about the silence in this chamber? What would Dr. Samuel Johnson of Connecticut say about the silence in this chamber? What would William Patterson or William Livingston or David Brearley or Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey, the signers of the Constitution, have to say about the silence in this Senate which they created? What would Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Mifflin, James Wilson, Robert Morris of Pennsylvania have to say? What would Thomas Fitzsimmons or Gouverneur Morris, who signed the Constitution on behalf of the state of Pennsylvania, have to say about the silence that rings and reverberates from these walls today? The silence with respect to the war on which we're about to enter. What would they have to say? What would their comments be? Gunning Bedford, George Reed, Delaware, Daniel Carroll, Dan of St. Thomas Jenifer, of Maryland. These and more. What would these signers of the Constitution have to say about this Senate, which they created, when they note the silence that is deafening, that emanates from this chamber on the great subject, the great issue of war and peace? Nothing is being said, except by a few souls. Yet this chamber is hauntingly silent, on what is possibly the eve of horrific infliction of death and destruction on the population of the nation of Iraq. Think about that. Oh, I know Saddam Hussein is the person who is primarily responsible, but how about us? How about ourselves? Yes, there are going to be old men die. There'll be women die. There'll be children. Little boys and girls will die if this war goes forward. In Iraq, and American men and women will die too. Iraq has a population, I might add, of which over 50% is under age 15. Over 50% of the population in Iraq is under age 15. How about what is said about that? This chamber is silent. Silent. On what is possibly only days before we send thousands of our own citizens to face unimagined horrors of chemical and biological welfare, this chamber is silent. The rafters should ring. The press galleries should be filled. Senators should be at their seats, listening to questions being asked about this war, questions that the American people out there have a right to expect answers to. The American people are longing for information, and they're not getting it. This chamber is silent. On the eve of what could possibly be a vicious terrorist attack in retaliation for our attack on Iraq, it is business as usual here in the United States Senate. And business as usual means it's pretty quiet. Not much going on in the United States Senate. Business as usual. No, I know it may be scare talk to talk about what may happen in the event of a terrorist attack. But when the Twin Towers fell, it wasn't scare talk. When hundreds of local firefighters and police officers, law enforcement officers, died as the walls of the Twin Towers came tumbling down, it wasn't scare talk. It wasn't scare talk. We're truly sleepwalking through history. In my heart of hearts, I pray that this great nation and its good and trusting citizens are not in for a rudest of awakenings. To engage in war is always to pick a wild card. And war must always be a last resort, not a first choice. But I truly must question the judgment of any president who can say that a massive, unprovoked military attack on a nation which is over 50% children is in the highest moral traditions of our country. This war is not necessary at this time. Pressure appears to be having a good result in Iraq. Our mistake was to put ourselves in a corner so quickly. Our challenge is now to find a graceful way out of a box of our own making. Perhaps, just perhaps, there is still a way if we allow more time. Madam President, I yield the floor.